Part 7. 7, sorry. Slide 45. Endotoxin. Endotoxin on page 430, or starts at page 430. So we have looked at this term endotoxin before. Endotoxin is a component of gram-negative outer membranes. Endo means kind of within. It's called endotoxin because the toxin is part of the cell itself. Different then to exotoxin, in the exotoxin is made and released. The endotoxin is part of the cell structure, the innate cell structure. We'll look at then some of the damaging effects of the immune response. So we've seen this picture before, or one very similar to it, and we've talked about endotoxin before too, an intrinsic part of the gram-negative bacteria. Endotoxin is specifically the lipid A of LPS. LPS stands for lipopolysaccharide. Lipid A triggers an inflammatory response. Again, we've got to cast our minds back to our immune response and our B cell activation. We have our T dependent and our T independent antigens. T independent antigens includes lipopolysaccharide and endotoxin, because it'll activate B cells without the need for T cell confirmation. So this is perhaps a good idea because it means that bacteria invade and they're gram-negative, and very quickly an immune response. B cells will trigger, turn into plasma cells. They'll produce IgM, that 5-spoked IgM, and the IgM will stick to the bacteria very quickly, and maybe then the bacteria can be removed from the body. So maybe it's like a quick, a rapid response against gram-negative infection. But the problem comes when this inflammation is systemic. And once again, inflammation, always damaging. Systemic inflammation can be very damaging, even fatal. Septic shock or endotoxic shock is when we have widespread systemic inflammation because of the reaction to gram-negative LPS and endotoxin. So lipid A inside our gram-negative membrane, typically a problem when it's released following the death and lysis of the bacterial cell. This will then activate the innate and adaptive defenses. Toll-like receptors will recognize it and trigger inflammation. And we also had then B cells activating without T cells via the T-independent system. So again, recall back to things like toll-like receptors, TLRs, in membranes of sentinel cells. So endotoxin is typically a cause of indirect damage. The endotoxin triggers the immune response, and the immune response triggers inflammation. One of the symptoms of endotoxin poisoning is this thing called disseminated intravascular coagulation. So disseminated means it happens all over, so it's a systemic. Intravascular means it happens in your blood vessels, and coagulation to do with clotting factors and the thickening up, and coagulation means to stick together. So what we have is a condition in which blood clots form throughout the body. So typically you think of blood clots and coagulation and clotting factors when you cut your skin and it starts to bleed and then it stops bleeding because blood clots have closed off the damaged areas. In this case, the blood clots happen all throughout the body. They can block small vessels. So we have different kinds of blood vessels in our bodies. One kind of blood vessel that's very important are capillaries. Capillaries can be very narrow, so narrow that sometimes even red blood cells have to pass through them single file. And if we have a clot, the clot can block the blood vessel, and any of the tissues, any of the cells downstream that were relying on the oxygen from the red blood cells, they don't have access to oxygen. In addition to that, they also CO2 is building up in these cells, and those conditions are toxic to cells. If you hold your breath for more than 3 minutes, you die because cells need oxygen to run their electron transport chains. Electron transport chains making ATP, cells using ATP for all of their biochemical reactions. Another kind of ironic effect is that since all of these little clots are forming all throughout the body, you only have a certain supply of clotting agents, and if all those clotting agents are scattered throughout the body, then you have no more clotting agents to actually control bleeding. So this is someone who was suffering from disseminated intravascular coagulation. They bumped their arm. The fine capillaries were damaged. The blood started leaking out into their tissues. There was no clotting agents available to actually do the job themselves. So the blood loss was not controlled. All of the clotting agents had been used up elsewhere around the body. So an analogy might be that if there are prank calls to the fire department all over a city, and the fire department is spread far and wide, but there's no actual fire for them to put out, and then there is a real fire somewhere, you don't have the resources to tend to the real fire. Clotting itself is part of the inflammatory response. You can realize that it's a very complicated response. But inflammation leads to release of mediators from platelets. Platelets are an important element in clotting, and that can lead to more inflammation. So clotting and inflammation are closely linked. When we have inflammation, I think we've covered this a little bit. Let's do it again. One of the other hallmarks of inflammation is the recruitment of phagocytes. Neutrophils in particular are the ones to blame in this situation. Neutrophils are a type of granulocyte. They contain granules, and those granules contain toxic chemicals. things like reactive oxygen species and nitric oxide species. Sometimes neutrophils can be phagocytes, they'll gobble up bacteria, but sometimes they just kind of burst. They will burst and release their granules. So here's the body cells. Here's the bacteria that is attached to the body cells. Here's our neutrophil arrived at the scene. So body cells, bacteria, neutrophil. Here are our toxic granules inside the neutrophil. And one response from the neutrophil is just to barf out all those toxic chemicals. And yes, that kills the bacteria, but at the same time, it's damaging to our own tissues. Release of nets, neutrophil, neutrophil extracellular traps, again, bursting of the neutrophil, releasing all those toxic chemicals. Damaging tissue, part of the inflammatory reaction. Inflammation itself, just the swelling. In inflammation, the blood vessels get leaky and dilated. That means more fluid to the site, more fluid lost in the tissues, and the tissues swelling. We saw a particularly pronounced effect of that in the helminth infection of elephantiasis, where swelling distends the body. That swelling is from a different mechanism. That is the inability of fluid to be lost. In inflammation, it is the building up of the fluid that is the problem. But there are many delicate parts of the body, particularly the meninges. Those are the membranes that surround the brain and the nervous tissue. If that swells, there's only so much space. If the space in your brain is being taken up by swollen tissue, that means that it is pushing into the brain itself and damaging it. Also on the spinal column, no space, so much space. If swollen meninges are crushing nervous tissue, then that's damaging. Meningitis can lead to permanent brain damage, even death within 24 hours. Fallopian tube infections leads to inflammation. Scarring from the inflammation obstructs the fallopian tubes as a result of, say, gonorrhea or chlamydia infections, and that can lead to infertility. A couple of last things to talk about, but we will talk about things like immune complexes in more detail when we look at the chapter on hypersensitivity. Immune complexes, when antibodies and antigens stick together in lumps, those lumps can have all kinds of effects. They can settle in blood vessels and kidneys and in joints, and then they can lead to inflammation. Cross-reactive antibodies. We've looked at some ideas about bacteria and viruses cloaking themselves in the host's own molecules. But then if a bacteria that is using our own molecules to defend itself is provoking the immune response just might start making a response against the host's own molecules. It makes the response against the molecules in that the bacteria is using for defense, but those molecules are very similar, if not the same, as the molecules that exist in your own tissues. So antibodies against the bacterial version of those molecules will also stick and lead to damage of our own tissues. Acute rheumatic fever following S. pyogenes infections, a variation of autoimmune response. Okay, damage to the host endotoxin. Know what it is, know what kinds of cells it comes from, know its effects on the body. Indirect effects, particularly the effects of inflammation from the immune response. Also, immune complexes and cross-reactive antibodies. Know why they're a problem, know what kind of damage can be caused. Okay, that is that for this set of lectures.